When you think of the American West, what comes to mind? Cowboys galloping through dusty plains, daring gunfights in sleepy frontier towns, and endless adventures under a blazing sun. It's a thrilling image that Hollywood and dime novels have sold for over a century. But what if I told you that this version of the Wild West is only half the story? The real West was far from the romanticized tales we've been fed. Beneath the surface lies a world of untold stories. Grit, survival, voices silenced by history, and struggles for power and justice. These hidden histories reveal the true builders of the West, the conflicts that defined it, and the environmental and social costs that came with it. Forget what you think you know about the Wild West. The reality is more fascinating and far more complex. Here's a truth that doesn't make it into the classic Westerns. The American West wasn't built by lone cowboys or rugged pioneers. It was built by countless hands, many of them belonging to people history chose to overlook. The American West was a vast expanse, filled with promise and peril in its early days. For thousands of years, it was home to Native American tribes that lived off its land, developing rich cultural and spiritual ties to the region. Yet in the 19th century, the arrival of European settlers set off a chain reaction that would change the land and its people forever. As settlers poured into the West, indigenous peoples faced an existential crisis. For centuries, tribes had thrived in harmony with the land, developing sophisticated societies and spiritual connections to their territories. But the arrival of settlers disrupted these lifeways, setting the stage for a battle for land and survival. The U.S. government's approach to indigenous populations was calculated and ruthless. Treaties were often used as tools of deception, promising protection and resources in exchange for land. But once the ink dried, these agreements were ignored or rewritten, leaving tribes impoverished and displaced. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 exemplified this betrayal, forcing entire nations, like the Cherokee, to march westward in brutal conditions on the infamous Trail of Tears. Yet, indigenous resistance was unyielding. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and Crazy Horse emerged as symbols of defiance, organizing their people to fight against encroaching settlers and military forces. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 was one such moment of triumph, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated General Custer's troops in a stunning display of strategy and courage. Resistance wasn't limited to warfare. Indigenous leaders also turned to diplomacy and legal battles, challenging land grabs and broken treaties in courtrooms. Meanwhile, cultural resistance flourished. Even as boarding schools sought to erase native identities, families kept their traditions alive in secret. Languages, dances, and ceremonies were passed down, ensuring that future generations would carry their heritage forward. The environmental changes brought by settlers further strained indigenous communities. The near extermination of the bison, a cornerstone of life for tribes like the Sioux, wasn't just ecological. It was an act of cultural warfare. The disappearance of this vital resource forced many tribes to rely on government rations and live in reservations, deepening their dependence and vulnerability. When we think of westward expansion, it's easy to picture covered wagons and rugged individualists heading into uncharted territory. But what textbooks often leave out is the sheer magnitude of the displacement and violence that fueled this expansion. Take, for instance, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. It paved the way for the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans. Entire nations, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek, were uprooted and marched to new territories in what would later be known as the Trail of Tears. This was not a peaceful migration. It was a brutal exodus. While the government justified this policy as a necessary step for progress, it was clear that land greed was the driving force. As gold and other resources were discovered across the West, boom towns sprang up almost overnight. These towns were the epitome of opportunity and chaos, thriving on the promise of wealth, but often crumbling as quickly as they rose. The story of these frontier cities is one of rapid growth, inevitable collapse, and the fleeting nature of fortune. Towns like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Virginia City became infamous for their wild, lawless atmospheres. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels dominated the main streets, catering to the miners and fortune-seekers who flooded the area. Violence was a constant presence, with disputes over claims or drunken altercations frequently ending in bloodshed. Law enforcement was often scarce and vigilante. Justice took its place. Despite the chaos, boomtowns were also centers of innovation and community. Merchants, blacksmiths, and hoteliers moved in to provide essential services, turning makeshift camps into functioning towns. Schools, churches, and newspapers followed, creating a sense of permanence and normalcy amid the unpredictability. However, the success of these towns was tied to the resources that fueled them. When the gold or silver veins ran dry, so did the prosperity. Abandoned buildings, empty streets, and shattered dreams were all that remained of once thriving communities. Ghost towns became haunting reminders of the fleeting nature of the frontier's promise. The rise and fall of these towns also highlighted the harsh inequalities of the West. While miners toiled for a chance at wealth, the merchants, land speculators, and business owners often truly profited. The gap between the haves and have-nots was stark, with many laborers leaving empty-handed, while a select few capitalized on the boom. And then there was the building of the railroad. Steel tracks cut through mountains, deserts, and plains, connecting the East Coast to the Pacific, and turning once distant territories into bustling hubs of commerce. But the railroad story was far from a simple tale of innovation. It was also one of exploitation and upheaval. For settlers, the railroads were a lifeline. They brought goods, services, and people to remote areas, making life on the frontier more sustainable. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was a marvel of engineering that united a fractured nation after the Civil War. Towns sprang up along the tracks, and industries like mining and agriculture flourished as they gained access to distant markets. Yet, this progress came at a high cost. Thousands of laborers, many Chinese immigrants, toiled in dangerous conditions to build the railroads. These workers faced grueling hours, hazardous environments, and widespread discrimination. Paid less than their white counterparts, and often denied basic rights. Their contributions were marginalized in the West's narrative of triumph. The expansion of railroads also deepened the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Tracks often cut through tribal lands without consent, further fragmenting territories and disrupting traditional ways of life. The iron horse wasn't just a symbol of progress, but a tool of conquest, paving the way for settlers and soldiers to seize more land. Even settlers weren't immune to the downsides of railroad expansion. Many became trapped in cycles of debt, forced to pay exorbitant shipping fees to transport their goods to market. The railroads, controlled by powerful corporations, wielded immense influence, often at the expense of the communities they were supposed to serve. The era of the cowboy, spanning roughly from the 1860s to the 1890s, remains one of the most romanticized periods in the history of the American West. Contrary to the imagery of John Wayne and Hollywood's glamorization, a significant percentage of cowboys were African American, Native American, or Mexican. After the Civil War, newly freed black men headed westward, searching for opportunity, carving out lives as ranchers, wranglers, and trail bosses. The cattle industry boomed after the Civil War, with Texas at its epicenter. Millions of cattle roamed freely across the state, and the demand for beef in the growing cities of the East created a lucrative market. The solution was the long drive, a grueling trek along trails like the Chisholm Trail, which stretched from Texas to Kansas. Life on the trail was anything but glamorous. Cowboys faced scorching heat, freezing nights, and sudden storms. Stampedes could erupt at the slightest noise, and rivers had to be crossed with herds, often panicking midstream. Cowboys also had to contend with threats from rustlers, who sought to steal cattle, and encounters with Native American tribes, who viewed the herds as encroachments on their lands. The cowboy lifestyle was defined by hard work and camaraderie. Men of various backgrounds, including African Americans, Mexicans, and Native Americans, worked side by side. Despite the hardships, cowboys developed a unique culture with songs, traditions, and the iconic cowboy code of toughness and resilience. By the late 1880s, however, the open range began to disappear. The expansion of railroads meant cattle drives were no longer necessary, as railheads moved closer to ranch. Barbed wire, invented in 1874, allowed ranchers to fence off their lands, ending the era of free-ranging cattle. Severe winters, like the one in 1886 to 1887, decimated herds and further signaled the decline of the cowboy era. Though their time was brief, cowboys left an indelible mark on American culture. They became larger-than-life figures in dime novels, Wild West shows, and later Hollywood films. Yet behind the myth lies the reality of their lives, tough, dangerous, and far less romantic than the legends suggest. The cowboy's legacy endures as a symbol of independence and perseverance in the face of the rugged challenges of the West. Meanwhile, the rise of cattle ranching brought about conflicts. The open plains were not as open as settlers imagined. Native American tribes like the Comanche and Apache fiercely resisted the encroachment of their lands. Battles over territory erupted across the West, with devastating consequences for indigenous people. By the late 19th century, policies like the Dawes Act of 1887 sought to dismantle tribal structures further, dividing communal lands into individual plots and selling the rest to settlers. Land wasn't the only prize in this great westward push. Resources were equally at stake. Timber, minerals, and water all became commodities to be exploited, with little regard for the long-term environmental impact. In Nevada, the Comstock lode unleashed a silver mining frenzy that transformed the state's landscape, while Montana and Colorado became hubs for copper extraction. But these riches came at a cost. Native communities were often pushed to the brink, while workers in these industries faced grueling conditions and meager wages. One story often overlooked in discussions of the American West is that of the Mexican and Mexican-American population. Long before the United States annexed Texas, California, and other southwestern states, these regions were part of Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War, transferred vast territories to the U.S., and, with them, thousands of Mexican citizens. Overnight, they became strangers in their land, subject to discrimination and land seizures. Despite this, they played a crucial role in shaping the culture and economy of the West, from agriculture to architecture. Women, too, had a role in shaping the West. The popular narrative often casts them as pioneers' wives or schoolteachers, but many women defied these stereotypes. Some ran businesses, while others worked as activists, advocating for workers' rights and Native American causes. Figures like Sarah Winnemucca, a northern Paiute author and activist, fought tirelessly to preserve her people's culture and protect their land. The West also became a testing ground for new social experiments. In the late 19th century, as urban centers in the East grew overcrowded, reformers turned to the West to try out progressive ideas. Settlements like New Harmony in Indiana and the Oneida community in New York experimented with communal living, shared property, and alternative social structures. But not all these experiments were benign. The rise of Mormonism, for example, brought both innovation and controversy to the West. After facing persecution in the East, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints moved westward, eventually establishing Salt Lake City as their headquarters. While they contributed significantly to the development of Utah, their practice of polygamy drew criticism. It led to conflicts with the federal government. As the 19th century progressed to the 20th, the myth of the American West became more entrenched. Stories of heroic settlers and noble cowboys filled dime novels, while Wild West shows like Buffalo Bill's traveling spectacle captivated audiences worldwide. Yet, these tales often glossed over the darker realities: the loss of native lands, the exploitation of laborers, and the environmental toll of unchecked expansion. In the 20th century, the American West underwent yet another transformation. With the advent of Hollywood, the region became synonymous with the frontier mythos, a place where good always triumphed over evil, and rugged individualism reigned supreme. But behind the scenes, new power structures were taking shape. Corporations and the federal government began to dominate the region, exploiting its resources on an industrial scale. For instance, the Hoover Dam, completed in 1935, symbolized both the promise and the peril of modernity. While it provided much-needed water and electricity to the growing cities of the West, it also marked a turning point in the region's environmental history. The dam fundamentally altered the Colorado River's ecosystem, affecting everything from fish populations to Native American livelihoods. The American West was also a focal point for social change during the 20th century. The civil rights movement found echoes in the Indian Americans, Mexican Americans, and other marginalized groups in the region. The American Indian movement, founded in 1968, sought to reclaim native lands and preserve indigenous cultures, staging high-profile protests like the occupation of Alcatraz Island. At the same time, the West became a laboratory for economic experimentation. The rise of Silicon Valley in California turned the region into a global hub for technology and innovation. At the same time, the oil boom in states like Texas and North Dakota reshaped local economies. Yet, these developments often came with significant social and environmental costs, from income inequality to climate change. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s is a prime example of this dichotomy. Popular accounts often focus on resilience, the image of families packing up their belongings and moving westward, hoping for a new start in California. But the environmental catastrophe itself, a result of years of poor farming practices and relentless land exploitation, revealed the fragility of the region's prosperity. The overcultivation of the Great Plains combined with drought turned once fertile land into a barren wasteland. For many farmers, the dream of the West became a nightmare. States like Oklahoma and Kansas were particularly hard hit, with hundreds of thousands forced to abandon their homes. The influx of migrants to California created tensions as local communities struggled to accommodate the population growth. These Okies, as they were often derogatorily called, found themselves in dire conditions, living in makeshift camps and working as underpaid laborers in fields. For many, the promise of the West as a land of opportunity was a bitter illusion. Labor struggles became a recurring theme in the American West during this period. While the gold and silver rushes of the 19th century had faded, new industries emerged, exploiting the land and its people. Coal miners in Colorado and Montana, timber workers in Oregon, and agricultural laborers in California all faced harsh working conditions and meager wages. Strikes and protests became common, with clashes between workers and industrialists often turning violent. One of the most infamous examples was the Ludlow Massacre of 1914 in Colorado. Coal miners, many immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, had gone on strike demanding better pay and safer working conditions. In response, the mining company called in the National Guard, leading to a deadly confrontation. Over 20 people, including women and children, were killed in the attack on the miners' camp, highlighting the brutal lengths to which corporations would go to suppress dissent. As the West continued to evolve, the role of indigenous peoples remained a focal point of tension. While the early 20th century saw devastating policies aimed at assimilation, such as the boarding school system that forcibly removed Native children from their families, resistance persisted. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans, but this did little to address the systemic inequalities they faced. During World War II, the American West became a crucial hub for the war. Industrial cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, and San Diego boomed as factories churned out aircraft, ships, and weapons. This economic surge brought new opportunities for women and minorities, many of whom took up jobs previously reserved for white men. However, the war also exposed the darker side of American society. In 1942, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans. Over 120,000 people, most of them U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and sent to internment camps in remote areas of the West. Families lost their businesses, homes, and possessions, and many were forced to live in harsh conditions behind barbed wire. These camps, such as Manzanar in California and Heart Mountain in Wyoming, remain stark reminders of the fragility of civil liberties during times of national crisis. Post-war America brought another wave of transformation to the West. The rise of suburbanization and the growth of cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Denver signaled a shift in the region's identity. The construction of highways and the proliferation of automobiles made the West more accessible than ever, spurring tourism and new industries. But this expansion wasn't without consequences. Large-scale water infrastructure development, such as the Central Arizona Project and the Colorado River Compact, fueled urban growth but created severe water shortages for rural areas and native communities. The division of the Colorado River's water among 7 states, and later Mexico, sparked fierce legal battles, many of which continue to this day. The environmental impact of this rapid development became impossible to ignore. By the 1960s and 70s, activists began to push back against the unchecked exploitation of the West's natural resources. The establishment of national parks and wilderness areas, though a positive step, often came at the expense of indigenous peoples, who were displaced from their ancestral lands in the name of conservation. Meanwhile, the rise of the counterculture movement brought a new wave of settlers to the West. Hippies and other idealists flocked to communes and rural areas to escape mainstream society. While these movements challenged traditional notions of success and community, they also highlighted the West's enduring allure as a place of reinvention. However, for many Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and other marginalized groups, the West remained a site of struggle. The Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s led by activists like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, sought to address the exploitation of farm workers and the broader inequalities faced by Mexican Americans. Strikes, boycotts, and marches drew national attention to the plight of agricultural laborers, many of whom worked in inhumane conditions for poverty-level wages. At the same time, Native American activists were making their voices heard. The American Indian movement staged dramatic protests, including the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. These actions drew attention to treaty violations and the ongoing struggles of indigenous peoples to reclaim their lands and rights. The closing decades of the 20th century brought new challenges to the West. The rise of neoliberal economic policies and the globalization of industries reshaped the region once again. Manufacturing jobs declined, while technology and service industries rose to prominence. Silicon Valley emerged as the epicenter of the digital revolution, bringing immense wealth to the region, but also exacerbating income inequality. Urban centers like Los Angeles and San Francisco became cultural and economic powerhouses. Still, they also faced growing issues of homelessness, housing shortages, and environmental degradation. The once pristine image of the West as a land of opportunity and endless resources gave way to a more complicated reality. As we move into the 21st century, the untold story of the American West continues to unfold. Climate change has become one of the region's most pressing issues, with prolonged droughts, wildfires, and water shortages threatening the foundations of life in the West. Indigenous communities, long at the forefront of environmental stewardship, are leading efforts to address these challenges, drawing on traditional knowledge and practices to protect their lands and resources. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden West Side stories.